The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. According to a 2015 Nature report, there are more than 3 trillion trees on Earth. Trees are amazing. They're the lungs of the earth and home to millions of organisms, fungi, and animals, says Dr. Sally Aitken at UBC's Forestry Department and the lead of the AdapTree project. Without a doubt, one of the most successful species on Earth. But Aitken also warns they are a species under threat due to rapid environmental changes. The biggest challenge for trees is the rate of change. Because for time immemorial, trees have adapted to a changing environment, and they continue to do so, says Aitken. The objective of the AdapTree project, however, is to address the pace of change by identifying alleles in Douglas fir, spruce, western larch, jack pine, and lodgepole pine trees that have adapted to a variety of environments. Then, using genetic tools, the team at the AdapTree will work with a variety of stakeholders within forestry to identify strains of species that will survive in regions where environmental conditions are changing, and in particular quickly. The long-term goal is to ensure the health of the trees and forests using sophisticated genomic-based intelligence. I invited Dr. Sally Aitken of the Department of Forests and Conservation Sciences at UBC to join me for a conversation that matters about working with our trees to ensure they have long and healthy lives. Welcome.
Thank you, Stuart.
Trees are fascinating, aren't they?
Absolutely.
I was at a breakfast meeting this morning and I was explaining that we were having this conversation. I was really quite excited about it. I said, do you know that the genome of a tree is like 7 times more complicated than ours? And there was this look of astonishment. And I'm still astounded at how is it that trees have such complex genomes?
Yes, well, the conifers that we have so many of in BC have enormous genomes. And we actually still don't know why they're so large. These are really ancient organisms. They have fairly slow rates of evolution, but they've been so successful on the face of the earth.
Do you think it's the complexity of that genomic structure that has helped to ensure that their success as a species?
Well, we see in their genomes that there are more genes for traits related to adaptation to stress, which is interesting. So you think about a tree being stuck in one place for its lifetime, for decades, centuries, or even millennia, and it faces all kinds of onslaughts during that period. So they really do have high levels of stress tolerance and this incredible longevity.
And they seem to be able to adapt and have offspring, clearly, because I'm 3 trillion trees. I was doing a little research. 3 trillion trees, and they're everywhere on the Earth except for the Antarctic.
Except for the Antarctic, deserts, and at very high elevations.
At high elevation, that's right. True, yeah. But the adaptability is remarkable. I was driving past a little lake in northern Ontario once, and here's this little tree hanging onto a rock, and I'm going, it's begging for dirt. It's going, I need dirt. But yet, they seem to find ways to survive everywhere.
Yeah, and it's remarkable. And different species have different niches, different conditions that they can live under. But we have some species, individual species, that have enormous ranges. We've got species like Douglas fir that grow from Mexico up to British Columbia. And we've got species that go from sea level to almost tree line in some places. So dealing with a wide range of environments.
So when you take a look at, let's say, Douglas fir, and you go, okay, here you are in Mexico, all the way up in through British Columbia, do you see that the genome is the same, but there's a different expression?
We do see different gene expression. So genes are turned on and turned off at different rates for trees from different locations. But we also see other aspects of DNA sequence variation. that reflect where the trees are adapted to, and the climates, in particular, the climates that they're adapted to.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. I want to use the example of us because I know that we have the genomic structure that we're born with, but through our lives where we face, depending on where we are, different weather conditions, different kinds of water, different air, and so on, the food we eat. And there's an epigenetic element to that changes our structure. Do trees have that same epigenetic component in their lives?
So epigenetics has been studied more in other plants other than trees, but has also been studied in trees, and certainly within a generation, depending on the environments that trees are in, we do see the effects of epigenetic marks on gene expression. That's not an area that I'm an expert in, but we have studied gene expression in some of the trees that we work with from the standpoint of, do trees from different environments have those different expression levels that would be controlled by, in some cases, epigenetic factors, and we see big differences.
It's so fascinating to me. So you take a look at a tree, and generally I'll say to somebody, ask them, well, what's that tree made out of? And they'll go, wood. And I'll go, no, it's not. It's made of carbon. And this is where they play such a valuable role in ensuring that we have a healthy balance of the carbon and other natural gases that are in the atmosphere, that helping to keep that balance. What's the process that a tree goes through to be able to capture that carbon and then sequester it into its being and grow?
Yes, so trees, when they're healthy, are excellent carbon capture machines. They can take carbon dioxide. They take carbon dioxide out of the air through the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis produces sugars that are converted and used as the energy to form the other materials that trees are made of. So we get carbon stored in wood, in roots, there's carbon in foliage. So all parts of the tree, of course, are built of carbon structures. Wood is about 50% carbon by dry weight. And people have known that for a long time. But the other thing that trees do is that their fine roots feed a whole below ground ecosystem, and there's a lot of carbon stored in forests in the soil that we don't know nearly as much about, but it's a very important reservoir.
So these are organisms that are then feeding off of or living in the habitat that's created by the root system.
That's right, and they're feeding off of the carbon compounds, the sugars, etc., that the plants, and in forests, mainly trees, are providing into the soil, either from living material or from the breakdown of dead roots and dead leaves that fall on the surface and that kind of thing. So it's very interesting, all of the complexity of carbon storage in a forest.
Well, but also that on the ground and in the root system is then also providing nutrients for so many other species. So a tree is a tree, yes, and is vital to the health of the forest, but it also is providing a healthy living environment for so many other species.
Absolutely. So in a forested place like British Columbia, many of our species live in forests, and forests provide the habitat, provide the food, provide the energy sources for so many of those organisms. So forests are incredibly important for biodiversity, and and of course, plants are always at the base of every food web. So everything living in a forest ultimately is dependent on carbon that's being taken out of the air through photosynthesis.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So in my introduction, I said, for time immemorial, trees have adapted, and they have adapted to changing environments. And when that tree decides that's where it's going to live, I don't know that it necessarily goes through a conscious process the way that we do, but it winds up there, and that's where it stays. But as the world is now starting to change, do they need our help? Or can they figure it out on their own?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's something that my research group and many other research groups around the world are working on, and that's the question of how quickly can populations of any species adapt to climate change, and looking at trees in particular, how quickly can they adapt, and during the process of adaptation, what will those forests look like? So when we have a widespread, abundant species like lodgepole pine in the interior British Columbia, that species will be able to adapt and persist in all places where the climate is still suitable for lodgepole pine as a species. But the process of adaptation means that only some individuals survive and reproduce. And so the forest may go through quite an unhealthy period during that adaptation phase. But is lodgepole pine going to go extinct because of climate change? Well, no. It will continue to, some individuals will be able to survive new conditions. We can look at populations and see that the genes are there, the variants of genes are there to adapt to those new conditions, but they're at very low frequency. So do they need our help? Well, if we want to accelerate that process, if we want to have the trees we plant in the process of forestry or restoration survive at high rates, then yes, we want to consider not planting trees that from seeds collected from the local trees, but choosing seed sources, choosing populations that have better traits to survive those new conditions that we'll see in that location.
So a lot of those new conditions would be less water?
Yes.
And higher temperatures?
Yes.
So you say, okay, well, this species here, which is 250 kilometers south or more, is already living in an environment like that, and clearly they're healthy.
Yeah.
Well, what if we bring them here? But what do we know about their ability to survive if the temperature over here drops below what is their normal range?
Yeah.
And it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, they're doing well here in high heat and low water. Well, let's just move them.
That's right. So we have to, one of the trickiest things we face is what time period do we want to match these trees to? Because we have climate is warming, we're seeing more intense droughts, but this is happening over time. And so we could say, well, the tree's going to live for 80 or 100 years, so let's target 50 years out. But if we target 50 years out, the temperature 50 years out, and we go to a place that's historically had that temperature, those trees that we plant are going to be very vulnerable to cold events,
right,
just as you mentioned. Climate has already changed quite a bit. We've already had quite a bit of warming. So one thing we want to do is just match, making up for the warming that's already happened. And maybe we want to go a decade or two ahead, or maybe we want to plant a greater diversity of trees, some of which are adapted to temperatures a couple of decades out, and some of which are closer to present, because genetic diversity will help ensure that there are trees that will survive. So we've got to consider diversity, we've got to consider that target time, and we have to think about the fact that when we plant trees, if we're planting trees, the trees we plant today in a warming climate will face their coldest temperatures in the next decade, and seedlings are more vulnerable to cold than older trees. So this is we're trading off risks. The risk of doing nothing, the risk of the old status quo, which was collect seed locally, plant locally. That has risks with climate change, but if we move trees too far, too fast, we face other risks. So we've got to balance those things, and we also have to use diversity to solve this problem. Not just genetic diversity in what we're planting, and in BC there are provincial standards around the diversity, maintaining diversity in the trees of a given species that are planted, but we also have to plant different species.
Right.
So planting mixtures of species is becoming more common, and maintaining that genetic diversity as we use our best information available to better match seed origin, the populations we get seed from, with the planting environments.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So one thing I think is important to stress, because I made this mistake myself when I was talking to you in advance of our conversation, was, okay, so you're going to identify those alleles or genetic traits in one, and you're going to introduce them into the, and you went, no, we're not involved in genetic engineering. We're using genetic information to make informed decisions.
That's right.
I have that right now.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And we're using genetic information from DNA sequencing. We're also using genetic information from tests of how these different populations vary in surviving extreme drought, or in growing under mild drought, or how cold hardy they are. So we can put the trees through all these tests. We can, torture them. We can learn from them.
No, don't torture the trees.
The Ministry of Forests puts in many field tests where they can also see how trees from different populations do in different locations. And then what happens is there's seed orchards established for most of our trees that are frequently planted in the course of restoration. Those are orchards. These are trees that are managed to produce cones and seed the way that fruit trees are managed to produce apples or peaches, but they are producing. But each of those orchards is producing seed for a geographic area.
Yeah.
And so you have
very
these,
specific.
That's right. So we have these different seed orchards. Historically, they would have produced seed for the area that the trees they contain came from. But now we can take that seed and we can push it a little colder, a little uphill, a little farther north, and balance this sort of adaptation to new environments. And the provincial government has had a policy change to make that action, policy on Crown lands.
So the tricky thing about it, as you're describing that, I go, agriculture has incorporated these practices for a long time. The maize that is grown in the southwest corner of Idaho is different than the maize that's grown in Ontario. And they have the ability, and over time now been able to amass the information that says this variety is going to work in this environment because of temperature and access to water and all those things. You grow corn. You've got 90 to 120 days that it grows, and did it or didn't work. And so you can adjust and adapt pretty quickly with the information that you're getting. Trees, you got to wait a long time before you know whether or not it worked.
Yeah.
And that makes, I'm thinking about the magnitude of what you're trying to do and say, how do you build the database that allows you to start to pinpoint, yep, this species is going to do well here because this is what's happening.
Yeah. So we're really fortunate with forest trees. People have been putting in experiments for centuries to evaluate where they should be getting seed from or how far they could move seed. So this was done in Europe more than 200 years ago. These kinds of experiments started. I'm sure Indigenous peoples did experiments like this. To identify their best seed sources for the plants that they cared about. Well, with forestry, we have a tradition of these kinds of experiments, and because many of them were planted in the past, we can go to those experiments and we can look at them today, and they become climate change experiments because different populations were planted together in several locations, and we can understand those relationships. So that's been a very fruitful source of information. But often the trees weren't pushed into warm enough environments or dry enough environments to answer all the questions that we've got. So these kinds of experiments are still going in, and they are long-term, and it's a challenge because we don't have a long time to deal with climate change. One other advantage we have with the trees is that we can look, in those older experiments, we can look at tree rings and get an idea of how tree growth has responded to weather conditions in different years in the past, to understand something about their tolerance, their resilience to extreme conditions, their plasticity in terms of how they behave. And so that's been a big source of information. But we also have genomic tools now where we can better understand the differences among populations. We can look for genes that show a signal of being associated with temperature, with high temperatures or with low temperatures, with drought, etc. And so this is another tool in the toolkit.
So are you at that point where the forestry sector, which is in business, says, okay, we accept your findings and we're going to do as you suggest? Or is there still uncertainty about what's the best path forward?
Yeah. So in fact, because 95% of the managed forests in British Columbia, managed meaning forests intended to be harvested and planted for producing raw materials, 95% of those forests are on public land. So what's acceptable to plant is dictated by policy, and the policy has been put in place around climate-based seed transfer, that climate change has to be taken into account in choosing what to plant. So that's been a really important step, and British Columbia has been ahead of jurisdictions around the world in implementing that policy. So industry has had to accept that. Now, before, when that new policy, climate-based seed transfer, was optional for several years, companies could follow the old rules around seed source, seed material, or they could switch to the new rules. And something like 60% or more of the planting was following the new rules, because they provided a bit more flexibility, and because foresters recognize the challenge of climate change and recognize the impacts climate change is having on the forests they manage. The one hesitation that comes up is that by planting the seed from elsewhere that might be adapted to warmer conditions, you do face some risks in those first years. As we talked about, the risks of cold impacts, the cold injury. And the companies, if they have the rights to log, they have the responsibility to plant and to have the planted trees survive and grow well. If something happens to those trees, they have to go back and plant again, and at that point they might have to do more work to prepare the site because it's longer after logging and everything. So there's a risk to them if there's failure, and they aren't in a situation where they're going to benefit from the better growth of those trees in 50 or 75 years. Because they don't have tenures that long, but they don't want the risks of if there's failures in that short term. So it's really a bit of a conundrum. That's what's better for the forests in the long run might not be what's better for in terms of risk in the very near future, which is what the industry takes on. So my social science colleagues have done some analyses around these things, and it's been quite interesting.
There's still work to be done.
Absolutely.
But this is exciting work that can help us to make better and better decisions and to help ensure that we have healthy forests.
Yeah.
You know, it's a complex topic. We've burned through 22 and a half minutes already in conversation. I wish that we could go on more, but I also applaud you for the work that you're doing and hope that it's going to continue to provide everybody who works in the sector with the information that they need to ensure the health of the forests.
Yeah, thank you.